Hi, I am Woochia and I want to show you tricks you can do with Distortion for mixing and sound design. I have several to show you and they build upon each other, so that will go from the most basic to the most advanced. And to show you those tricks, I'd like to use the plugin P44 Magnum by Pulsar Modular. This is a plugin for mixing and mastering that allows you to shape and color your mixes, so we'll put this on a group or a full mix for better results. And basically it has three bands. There is oomph for the subs, Pumph is for the basses, and sweet is for the highs. All that goes to a dry wet and then a saturation, and you can activate a clipper at the bottom here. So right now everything is off and you need to activate each knob with their LEDs there to hear what they do. The oomph will boost the sub as soon as you activate it, and you can choose the frequency to boost with the knob, and the smooth slider next to it will push down the lower edge of that boost to tighten and control it more. Then the Pumph knob works exactly in the same way, but on higher frequencies, so the two interact and combine to allow you to shape your bass regions and mold them like Play-Doh with the help of the smooth sliders. So let's hear how they sound on this track. Then the sweet knob is a combination of saturation, EQ and widening effects to enhance the top of the spectrum. And then you have this slider next to the dry wet that is called O2. That will bring out some harmonics from within the track to separate elements better. So if there's a vocal in the track, for example, that should push it up and make it a bit clearer. Alright, so now that we know what we are looking at, let's go to the first tip, the easiest, which is to use a distortion with filters and realize the difference it makes to use a filter before rather than after the distortion. When you put a distortion on a sound, it will add harmonics in it. So if you put a filter after, you will build a sound by selecting frequencies from the result of that saturation, which is a technique that works well if you start with a sound that is poor in harmonics. But if you start with a sound that is rich in harmonics and you put a filter first to send only a selected band to the distortion, then only those selected frequencies will generate harmonics with the distortion, and that can be used to color your distortion. And that is something you have built in the P44 with the clipper at the bottom. The clipping will happen at the end of the chain, so you can use the oomph and pumph before it to color the distortion. Now, instead of coloring a distortion by putting a filter before it to remove frequencies before it, you can color it by adding more frequencies before the distortion. To show you where this idea comes from, this is a very low sine wave and white noise going together in the distortion, which is a very common way to design heavy basses. Hear how the sub becomes crunchier as the noise gets crushed against it. So that is something you can do to your sound. You can add a little bit of white noise to your track before sending it to a distortion to add a little bit more crunch. You can do this either by adding white noise to a parallel track or by using the erosion effect if you're on Ableton, for example. Now, to build upon this idea, let me show you what happens when you distort a low tone and a high tone heavily together. Just like a low tone with noise creates crunch, a low tone with a high tone creates a screech. It's like a low tone distorted with any high frequency content creates weird and interesting textures. So you can use that in your tracks. Instead of adding noise to a sound, you can add a low sub before distorting it, and that's one of my favorite things to do. Hear what happens when I distort this bass and add a sub frequency to it. Notice how the tone changes when I change the volume of the sub. Now, to go further down this rabbit hole of sound design, I want to retake this example of a low tone and a high tone being distorted together. Because you can kind of do that with the frequencies you already have in a sound, with what I like to call a two-peak distortion. Just before a distortion, you can put an EQ and make two peaks to boost two narrow bands of frequencies. Then those two bands will get crushed together in the distortion and add a lot of grits to your sound. And you can boost them as much as you want because they will be clipped anyway by the distortion. The only thing is that you need to start with a sound that is rich in harmonics, because it needs to have frequencies to boost in the first place for this to work. And if you want to push this effect further, instead of using an EQ, you can use two bandpass filters in parallel to really extract and isolate two bands of frequencies before crushing them with a distortion. So sending two pitches to a distortion can create very interesting results. And that result can be very different depending on the interval between the two pitches. Like we've seen, two notes far apart can make screeches. And if you play two notes that are close, you get a rhythm. And you can combine the two. First, create an instrument. I will start with a simple sine wave and put a heavy distortion on it. Now try to play different intervals, large and small, to see how they sound. This is a good way to create sequences, for example, where the sound would change a lot between two notes. And then try to play more than two notes and combine narrow and large intervals. This can create very nasty sounds that you could record and resample to create a new instrument, for example. And now for the comparison, here is how the same sequence sounds with sawtooth waves instead of sine waves. So distortion on one sound is great, but distortion on several sounds hides so much more possibilities. And I want to use this as a reminder to use distortion on groups in your mixes. Because a distortion will boost a signal and then crop the peaks of the waveform. So it will essentially reduce the dynamic of a sound. And we can use it as a compressor essentially, but a compressor that distorts the sound. Using a clipper on drums, for example, is actually a very common technique nowadays to get heavy, powerful kicks and snares. So it could be used on a group as well with kind of the same spirit. So to try it, let's see what it does on this drum track. The last thing I wanted to talk about is that when you use a distortion on a sound, you will add harmonics to it. But the frequencies that were already there before the distortion will still be there after. And sometimes you want to hear only the frequencies that are being added, like if you want to use it as a top layer to add some grit to your sound, or to add a clean sub underneath. On the P44, you have a delta button here that will do that for you, so you don't have to set up a whole effect track. But if you want to do that yourself, you want to have two parallel chains. In one chain you will put your distortion, as you would normally do, And in the other chain, you will keep the signal clean, but invert its phase with a utility effect, for example. This way, all the frequencies in the clean sound that are now inverted will cancel the same frequencies that are in the distorted channel, so you should be left with only what the distortion added. So these are all the techniques I wanted to show you today. Check out Pulsar Modular's website for more info on the P44 Magnum. You can get a free trial of the plugin there if you want to experiment with it. In the meantime, I wish you all a great day, take care, and see you next time.